No, just look at the schedule. It's November 5th. Okay, I guess one announcement. People keep asking me about the histology quiz. On your schedule, it's November 5th. I did put it in the wrong column. I think that's why there's confusion about that date.
Yes.
November 5th. Highlighted on your schedule. It's there. All right, so the anatomy of blood vessels, I usually do head and neck, upper limb and lower limb. I don't do all the blood vessels. I don't do the blood vessels of the abdominal cavity. I teach those with digestion and kidney at the end of the course. So we'll do all the other ones, head, neck, upper limb, lower limb. Yeah, so there are, start with major vessels of the neck. The two principal arteries in the neck region are the common carotid artery and the subclavian artery. Two major arteries. Of the neck. Common carotid arteries and the subclavian arteries. There's right and left for both. Hey, I got my heart thing queued up. Let me just highlight those two. There's a subclavian on the right side. There's common carotid on one side, and then on the other side they highlighted a different color. Oops, I didn't know that one. Okay. Anyways, those are it. You should already know those from your studies of the heart. Okay. We call those our arteries of the neck, basically. I'll come back to the app every now and again. So every once in a while, there's something I can show you better. And we'll start with the common carotid artery. Okay. And here's a picture of that from the Atlas of Anatomy that I used for this class. And well, what you see is the common carotid artery. You already know it. On one side, it branches off the aortic arch. On the other side, it's a branch of the brachiocephalic trunk. On the right side, it does that. So that's the left side. And what I want you to see here is that the common carotid, whenever you see the word common to a blood vessel, you know it's going to branch and give rise to some other blood vessels. The common carotid bifurcates and gives rise to the internal and external carotid arteries. Common carotid artery. First thing I'll say, it bifurcates. That means it branches. And the carotid bifurcation is indicated, and it occurs at the same level as the superior border of the thyroid cartilage. That's why they show that thing there. That's your voice box. You can feel your Adam's apple there. That's kind of where the bifurcation is, just kind of lateral to it. So I'll say at the superior border of the thyroid thyroid cartilage. So it gives rise to the internal and the external carotid arteries. Well, so then the challenge becomes, how do you tell which one's internal, which one's external? The names are given because one kind of stays external to the skull, the internal one actually enters the skull. But the easy way to tell, no matter what you're looking at, in the neck, the external carotid gives off many branches that kind of go to different places on the external skull. The internal, in the neck, doesn't give off any branches. It gives off branches later when it's in the skull, but when the internal carotid is in the neck, it's just a tube going up in your skull. It doesn't give off any branches. That's how you can tell. So the external in the neck gives off many branches. The internal one in the neck does not. Okay? So you have to know those branches, of course. So let's learn some of the branches off of the external carotid artery. Here's another picture. Once again, it's similar. You can see the bifurcation at about the level of the superior border of the thyroid cartilage. You're expected to know these landmarks. Okay? It's part of the anatomy here. And the internal one is cut off. And the external one, you can see, is giving up all these branches. Three kind of go anteriorly. Branches of the external carotid. Artery. It's pronounced carotid and spelled carotid. Basically, so you have common carotid, never forget your little A for artery, and you got the bifurcation, but anyways, the internal carotid artery is sometimes abbreviated ICA. You're not allowed to abbreviate it, but in terms of brevity for a lecture, yes, we sometimes just call it that. The external carotid. And give off a lot of branches. Now, three go anteriorly. From inferior to superior, it goes superior thyroid artery, lingual facial. So I'll just basically draw three lines going forward. Okay. So pointing to go anteriorly. So I'll just kind of number them from inferior to superior. So the first one coming off goes down to the thyroid. Okay, so the name of the artery tells you where its destination is, the superior thyroid artery. means tongue. So you can see the lingual artery going under the jawbone. It's going to go to the tongue. The third one is called facial. You can actually take your pulse right there. Some people can. It runs behind the jawbone. It follows the jawline basically. You can see a branch comes up there. Runs in the cheek. Facial artery. Okay. Now there's more branches coming off. They go to the back of the skull. So two go posteriorly. This one coming off is the occipital artery. That's the occipital bone of the skull. That's where it goes. One goes behind the ear hole, the external acoustic meatus. That is the posterior auricular artery. So one goes back there. One goes back there. So two go posteriorly. Occipital artery, posterior auricular artery. Auricle means ear, so this artery is literally just behind the ear. Okay. Your ear. Now the external carotid ends by bifurcating into two branches, okay? Where it ceases to be the external carotid. And so those two branches here, here's the external carotid. It gets to here the branches in the maxillary and superficial temporal, which stays on the superficial surface on the temporal bone. And superficial is a key word. I always tell students to watch out for it when they're dissecting the skull, and it's very easy to remove with the subcutaneous tissue if you're not careful. It's very superficial, and because those two branches kind of terminate the artery, they're called terminal branches of the external carotid. Two terminal branches. I'm just going to extend the line up more. One branch goes off there. And so that last branch point, one of those is maxillary, the other is superficial temporal, 6 and 7. Remember your facial bones of the skull, maxilla. Artery has that name because it's going there. Okay, it's hard to see. The maxillary artery, it means behind this condyle of the ramus, right there. And then the other one is the superficial temporal artery, number 7. Let's kind of look at that on the app just for a second. What I did was I highlighted. What's in purple is, let me get rid of this multi-selection thing here. Okay, what's highlighted is the external carotid in purple. You see where it ends? And you see two things coming off of it. Based on that, what is that one? Superficial temporal. And it tells you. So what's that one? That's maxillary. And if you kind of like, what I like about this, it has these origin path thing. And it just kind of shows you the artery going all the way back down to the heart. You want to isolate it. This app is really good for students. It gives you a general sense of where these things go. You can rotate around and play and really see it. Pictures of the book are very limiting, but you can see it's going to the front of your face. The maxilla, you know, it's basically your face. There was one branch coming off of it called the middle meningeal artery. I'm going to advance the slides here. Maxillary again. Okay, so middle meningeal artery, note that one. It's like right, that small branch. It's going to enter the skull. Okay, know that one. So we're kind of done with this now, but one branch coming off maxillary is the middle meningeal artery. That artery, it enters the skull via the foramen spinosum. So, if you're thinking, do I have to know that? Yeah. In fact, you already know it. Didn't you pass 430? Oh, man, I think I did, yeah. So go back and look that up if you have to. I'll kind of show it to you here. Excuse my sarcasm, but yeah, you guys know this. Now, there's a beautiful picture of it. So there's the foramen spinosum looking on the inside. You can see this artery comes in and branches all the way throughout there. It's really beautiful, actually. This artery and all its branches. Do you remember the meninges of the skull? We teach the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And, well, basically this is supplying blood, not to the brain, but to the meninges, those connective tissue coverings of the brain. So hence the name middle meningeal artery. It's clinically significant because it's kind of running on the lateral aspect of your skull where the skull bones are the thinnest. And if you get a blow to the side of the head and you get a fracture, and if that sharp, jagged fracture lacerates one of these branches, you can get bleeding inside the skull. It's called well, it's either epidural or subdural hematoma. So that's not good. And so that's kind of why we learned this artery. We don't like to see that, obviously. Middle meningeal artery. Well, we have it on models, and I have a picture of a model in the room, and the blue arrow is pointing to it in both locations, on the picture and on the model. Right there, we just looked at that, and there's a boom, middle meningeal artery. And this model even shows it going up in the foramen spinosum. Okay. Well, here's the topography of your face. It's a beautiful dissection if you can do it. And we have models of it, and you always see these classic pictures of it in the book. You can see some musculature of the face. And I put these images side by side because a lot of the images I'm teaching from are just skull and arteries. But of course, there's a lot more there in the head. And one thing to look out for is the parotid salivary gland. Okay, because deep to it, that's kind of where you get this terminal branch thing happening. Let me show you here. Deep to it. So, the picture on the left is more superficial. Pointer here. There's superficial temporal, the artery and the vein, they have the same name. There's the parotid salivary gland. It's a big salivary gland. There's a duct. It's going to pierce the buccinator muscle and go inside your oral cavity to help lubricate your food during chewing or mastication. So if you cut all that away, there's the masseter muscle, there's the ramus of the mandible, and you can see the artery there. And there is the maxillary, and there is the superficial temporal. They're kind of branching deep to the parotid salivary gland. So I'm pointing to that branch point, both blue arrows, okay? All right, well, I'm gonna move and kind of talk about the other principal artery of the neck, the subclavian. And if you remember, well, it's kind of hard to see, the black arrow is pointing to it. I already taught this as an artery that passes posterior to, remember the name of the muscle? Anterior scaling. Very good. All right. So, boom, that artery there. And there's three branches of it that I want to teach. And this picture kind of shows them all. Three branches I want you to know. Internal thoracic, thyrocervical trunk, vertebral artery. Three big ones. Thyrocervical trunk. It's got a lot of, this trunk itself has a lot of branches. Thyrocervical, it basically supplies a lot of branches to the lateral neck region. One I want you to know is going to go to the thyroid. Okay, so that branch there, the inferior thyroid artery, you know that one. I'll draw it as a branch of inferior thyroid artery. So we got the superior and inferior thyroid arteries there, okay? The other two branches of subclavian are vertebral artery as well as the one coming down here, internal thoracic. So you know where to look for it, inside your chest plate, internal thoracic. So, let me show you another picture of that. It's kind of, you have two of them, one on each side, and they flank the sternum. Okay. A blank picture you can study. Now, this model in the room has two of these three. It doesn't have all three. I kind of tell you what they are there: vertebral, thyrocervical trunk. The internal thoracic not shown on this model, but I got a picture of it here. So basically, they've removed the chest plate, but you can see the artery and the vein running down, and they give off all these little branches, okay, that are in the intercostal spaces. Let me see if we can look at it on the app. The app might be a little better for this one. So we're looking at the branches of what? Subclavian. There it is, subclavian. There we go. And let me hide you. Boom. There it is. Internal thoracic. Okay. Let me throw in another layer of arteries. The branches coming off. You highlight all of the anterior intercostals. What I'm trying to show you is coming off the internal thoracic artery, all of these anterior intercostal arteries. Okay, so know those branches. Do you remember learning the posterior intercostal arteries? Some people do, and they branch off the descending or thoracic aorta. See if you can see that, since you got the app. Little hide skeleton. Lights on, it's hard to see things. Let me turn them off. Okay, so there's the thoracic descending aorta. You can see all these paired posterior intercostal arteries. I highlight on one side there. So they come off the thoracic on the posterior side. Then the ones from the anterior side, come off the internal thoracic. So you got arteries in the intercostal spaces from the front and from the back. Well, we have a chest plate in the room. That's a picture of the inside of it. So based on information just taught, what do you think that's going for? Internal thoracic. What about that one? Anterior intercostal artery. Okay. And the vein. The arteries and the veins run together, and they would have the same name. So let's talk about a different artery, moving away from subclavian for now, and talk about the ICA, the internal carotid. So I'm pointing to a hole where it enters the skull. One thing you should know before I erase this, there are only two arteries that enter the skull to provide blood to the brain. This is one of them. Vertebral. Interskull via. Foramen magnum. And the other one is ICA, the internal carotid. That's the other one that enters the skull to supply blood to the brain. the internal carotid arteries, you can find it in the neck. Okay, but in the neck, like I said, it gives off no branches. Sometimes that's called the cervical part. It's one of the first things I look for when I dissect the neck. I found it the other day. It's the main artery of the neck. Goes right into the brain via the carotid canal. So the picture on the left, what you're looking at is an inferior view of the cranial base, and I'm pointing to where the carotid canal would be. So that's an inferior view. This zoomed in picture is kind of hard to tell what you're looking at, but that's the internal view of the cranial base. So inferior view, superior view. You can see the ICA emerging inside the skull there, kind of by the optic chiasm. Okay. Here's a lateral view of the ICA. What I did was I put it isolated on the left there. That's kind of it in the neck. Then it enters the carotid canal, which is not a straight canal. It's kind of a twisty tube. Then it gets inside the skull, and it gives up all these branches on the way. So notice that when it's in the neck, no branches. But as soon as it kind of enters the skull, it gives off many branches. Here it is literally inside the skull. Notice that when it gets inside the skull, it always makes this turn, this U-turn there. And as it kind of turns back, it gives off one branch that goes forward to the eye socket, this one here. That's called the ophthalmic artery. That is one branch of ICA I want you to know. Writing gives rise to OPH ophthalmic artery. Ophthalmic artery. Let's look at some more pictures of this. There you go. There's a big zoomed in picture. There's OPH ophthalmic. I always have to say that, so that's why I spell it right. Ophthalmic, OPH ophthalmic. You know, the ophthalmologist, your eye doctor, right? Okay. So that's ICA all by itself, the internal carotid artery. Here's some pictures to kind of orient us with how it would look on the inside of the skull. Here's the superior view of the cranial base. What we're going to see is I kind of point to the general area where the ICA emerges. It's kind of by foramen lacerum on the inside of the skull. So I'll just kind of give you a general idea of what to look for. Say look for ICA next to, say, optic chiasm. Foramen lacerum is another one. On the picture, the nerves are colored this bright yellow, so it's really easy to see. But foramen lacerum, and there's ICA next to the optic chiasm optic. There it is right there. And they show you a nice, beautiful picture of it going to the eyeball, eye socket. Okay. picture. It's the picture I showed you before. So these pictures kind of match. I always like my picture collection. There's ICA there. There's optic chiasm. There's optic chiasm there. Okay, optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract. But basically, know the ICA is emerging right in the skull right there. So now we're inside the skull, and we're kind of like underneath the brain. Let's remember that the brain sits on top of the cranial base. So one way you could study arteries of the brain is to study the ventral aspect of the brain, or you could study on the superior view of the cranial base, one of two things. Here's a picture of base of the brain. Underneath the brain, imagine this is sitting right on top of the cranium, the cranial base, and just to orient you, there's ICA, there's optic chiasm, okay? They cut it off, and that will be the pituitary right there. But you've got this kind of hexagonal circulation of arteries here. I still call it the circle of Willis. Okay, so this is kind of what I want to talk about here. I think books now call it cerebral, arterial, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I still call it circle of Willis. Willis is a person's name. There's a movement in AMP to get rid of all people's names in the terminology, but because I'm old school, I still use the names. All right, so let's kind of draw this out a little bit. I think that'll help you learn it a little more. Got this artery going in there, going this way. So basically, one on either side is bilateral, but it's the internal carotid. Okay, they cut it as it enters the skull. Now, if you follow the internal carotid, it gives off a branch immediately that goes anterior. Follow it, follow it. This goes anterior there. And that is the anterior cerebral artery. So when you start talking about like cerebral, that's the brain, right? So this is supplying blood to the brain. So kind of like there, anterior cerebral artery. And one side communicates to the other with a very short artery right there. I'll call it number 3. That's the anterior communicating artery. So one side can communicate with the other. So we call this the circle of Willis. And it's not really a circle, it's more like a hexagon. But anyways, that's half of it. Now the other half, the half down here, I can't really talk about because I have to talk about the vertebral artery and how it gets up in here. Remember, the vertebral artery is down in your neck. It's called the vertebral artery. It's a branch of the subclavian. So let's go back and take a look at that. I do want you to know that you have this brain with arteries model there. Some of this stuff is shown. But going back down, talking about the vertebral artery, it goes up the neck, and keep it queued up here. it is on the app. I just isolated it. So this is obvious why it's called vertebral artery. It ascends up the transverse foramen of cervical vertebra. And you can see it eventually goes in the skull. Well, anyways, what's the name of that big hole right there? Foramen magnum, yeah. So it goes right in there. It's ascending up the transverse foramen. Go back a little bit. Let me show you something else here. Occipital bone behind that guy. Got two vertebral arteries. They merge to form basilar artery. Basilar arteries on top of pons. There's basilar. So identify two vertebral arteries. They merge to form one basilar artery. We highlight the origin path. So you kind of see it faded out, going all the way back down to the neck, right? Identify. Subclavian. This branch coming up subclavian, vertebral artery, it extends up the neck, goes inside the skull, they merge to form what? Basilar artery. So let's take note of that. What I'm writing is vertebral arteries ascend in the neck via the transverse foramen of cervical vertebra C6 all the way up to C1. Transverse foramen of cervical vertebra C6 all the way to C1, atlas. And enter via foramen magnum and the skull. Last thing I'm writing, and merge to form the single basilar artery. The basilar artery is on top of the pons. So let's go back to that. Picture show here. And what we got, vertebral artery, we're still in the neck. There's the carotid system of arteries, the vertebral one right there. Okay. So basically in the neck, the vertebrae are like posterior neck. Anterior neck is all this stuff, your larynx, your hyoid bone. There's a lot of musculature there. You know, whenever, Jeff, the guy that runs Open Lab, whenever you do dissections like we did Monday, he always does this. He takes his fingers and he like shoves them in between this and this. You go, hey, look, I got through. You did it the other day. You tell him I told you that. Well, anyways, just to emphasize the point that you basically have anterior neck, posterior neck. The vertebral arteries ascending up the vertebra, posterior neck there, getting inside the skull. Here's a picture of a cervical vertebra. Remember the holes in the transverse processes there? You only see them in the cervical region. In the other regions of the vertebra, the transverse processes do not have holes in them. And it's only in the cervical region. Okay, well, anyways, okay, so to finish the story here, let's get back to this. The other thing I should note, I want to talk about the bottom half of this. And remember, we're referring to this picture here. Once the ICA gives rise to the anterior cerebral, it continues on as the middle cerebral artery. I guess we're on number 4. So basically, let me erase this now. Here's 2 vertebral arteries. They merge to form one basilar artery, number 6. The basilar artery gives rise to a lot of branches, but the 2 major ones that go like that are the posterior cerebral arteries, and they kind of connect to the top half here via posterior communicating. Let me draw it the same way. I notice these kind of connect medial to that. Sorry, I need to change this here. Should know that. Kind of like that. Okay. So, 5, 6, 7, 8. What we got? 5 is 2 vertebral arteries. Okay. And basically 1 basilar artery. And there's a lot of branches on the basilar artery, but the one like right there, the one on the top, is the posterior cerebral arteries. Number 7 on my picture. So to connect the bottom half to the top half, you have number 8, posterior communicating arteries. That's all I'll hold you responsible for that. It's the circle of Willis. Don't want to switch gears here. It's a good place to kind of pick up next time, and I want to get you ready for today's lab. Let me show you some of those slides I left off with on the blood pressure set. When we talked about baroreceptor reflex, and we stopped here. Signs of the chokeout. Now there's some questions here. And these are actually on your lab assignment for today. They're part of the write-up. Signs of the chokeout. And the reason why, we're going to watch a YouTube clip of this, and the reason why I like to do it is it kind of shows the reflexes we're talking about. And, well, we can't choke each other out here. I mean, they do on the clip I'm going to show you, but it's too unsafe for us to just choke us all out. Not going to do it. It's not queued up for me.
Force.
Wow. Yeah, it's just tightening up.
You notice he's around this throat, and the carotid. But that's nothing compared to mixed martial arts legend Fedor Emelianenko. He clamped down with 500 pounds of force. So we know what squeezes harder, but what we don't know is how little force it takes to choke a person out. To answer that, we're using a different kind of dummy altogether.
I'm about to get choked out by the baddest man on the planet.
That's right. Earlier in the show, sports science host John Brinkus sacrificed his entire body going up against NFL All-Pro defender Chris Jenkins. Now John's neck is literally on the line.
John's in trouble. John's gonna go to sleep. And, it's not a bad thing. I've been choked out many times. Only have a couple twitches from it now. It's not that bad.
The things I do for science.
We've rigged John up with sensors to show us what's going on inside his body as he's being choked out.
So this is a pulse oximeter. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture your heart rate, which will probably be high, and the oxygen saturation in your blood, which may go down, depending. So we'll see how the results are, but your heart rate will probably go up because you're stressed, and your oxygen will probably go down.
Do I look stressed?
A little bit.
You'll be okay. Don't worry.
Oh my god. I'm just extraordinarily freaked out right now.
Our dummy John's all rigged up and ready to go.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Are you ready? You're up to 136.
Oh my god.
A heart rate of 136 is almost twice as fast as the average resting heart rate, and we're just getting started.
Oh my god. You're sure you're not going to crush my windpipe? Alright, please do not hurt me.
You're at 141. Okay, John, are you ready?
Alright, I'm ready.
Okay, Pedro, are you ready?
Oh my god.
3, 2, 1.
John's heart rate spikes to 180. He's redlining, experiencing a severe panic attack, and the oxygen going to his brain has decreased by 15%. But that small decrease is enough to put our host out. John's heart rate and respiration leap in a frantic attempt to get blood to the brain. And when that doesn't work, John's brain shuts down. The brain needs 50 milliliters of oxygen a minute. That flow to John's brain has been cut by 15%. And if it's reduced by only another 5%, it could be enough to put him in a coma, or even kill him. But Fedor releases his grip on John's throat. And blood is coming back to the brain. John was choked out in 4 seconds, and it takes him 4 seconds to come back.
Do you want to do it again?
Oh my god, I really don't want to do that again.
We know Fedor can squeeze with 500 pounds of force, but with John, he didn't need nearly that much. He only used 40 pounds of force. That's the same amount of choking power as the python. Medical experts say it takes as much force to compress the carotid artery as it does to break this egg. That's less than 10 pounds of force. Not only could Fedor choke 12 times harder than a python, he put our host to sleep in a few seconds. And what did he think of our new dummy?
I have nothing but respect for John, because to have it done on you
You get a different perspective instead of just watching me do it to someone else.
Is that what he really said? Well, I give a lot of credit for that guy. I would not volunteer for that at all.
Well, anyways, the carotid artery, right? Just taught that. It's like right next to the windpipe. Crush that too. But anyways, for our class, let's remember that we're interested in the baroreceptor reflex, right? So go back and review that. I already taught it. And as the written portion of your next test is what I revealed last time. And what we have to know is that basically for today's lab, to help boost blood pressure, cold pressure test. Blood pressure gets too high, you want to see the reflex corrected. Or the opposite, you lie down, stand up, a transient drop in blood pressure, again, you want to see the reflex correct that. If it drops, it should go back up, and we'll be making blood pressure measurements. And so that's kind of today's lab. And there we are, you're going to lie down, and stand up, blood pulls away from the baroreceptors in the carotid and the aortic arch region, and then the body responds. If you have a drop in blood pressure, the body responds by boosting the heart rate to try to get it back to normal. The other thing you'll do is we'll change blood pressure and heart rate by exercising, and we're going to do it in a standard way. In the last lab, you're allowed to choose the mode of exercise, but here we're standardizing it. We're doing something called the Harvard step test. And well, basically, I'll show you a video of how to do it. We can't do it inside. You'll have to take our blood pressure cuffs and stethoscopes outside, go out as a group and do it, and be safe with our equipment out there. I've never had a problem. But there's benches over there, some place where you find a bench, as long as both subjects are using the same bench. I'll show you the meter you're supposed to use, 30 steps per minute. There's a certain cadence you're supposed to do, and let's kind of watch that clip.
Step testing is used for predicting cardiorespiratory fitness. Pre-exercise test guidelines include ruling out contraindications and determining proper precautions for participants with balance problems or those who are extremely deconditioned. Prior to performing the step test, the patient's resting heart rate is recorded. Resting heart rate is 66 beats per minute. Tools required for the step test include a stepper platform that is 20 inches high, a stopwatch, and a metronome. The participant is then instructed to step 30 steps per minute with the rhythm of the metronome. The test duration is 5 minutes or until exhaustion. Exhaustion is
All right, I think you get the idea. I just want to give you a visual of what it looks like. Both subjects should be doing it at the same time. I always like the guy playing racquetball in the background of the novel. It's like, yeah, he's fun to watch. But anyways, let's get back to going on here. Switch this. Okay. So for you guys, there's supposed to be 2 subjects in your group who will volunteer for this, and it's for 5 minutes. And the protocol calls for one well-conditioned, one poorly conditioned, and you may not have, well, if you have 2 people, there's a good chance they're unequal in terms of fitness level, so you can determine who's who. Yeah, and it's important that you do the same amount of work. So you can't, it's not a competition. You're not trying to outdo the other person. You want to do the same intense level for 5 minutes to see how the cardiovascular fitness level of a poorly or well-conditioned person compares. And we're going to be monitoring heart rate and blood pressure. So before you start, have them seated, and you want to take pulse and BP while seated before the exercise. And here's what the data table looks like in your labs. That's your baseline. And then they do the step test for 5 minutes. And if you're a subject doing this and it's too much, you can't go the whole 5 minutes, stop early. It's okay. But then that means, both subjects are stopped at the same time. And well, then immediately following the test, take a reading. And then 1, 2, 3 minutes post-exercise. We're going to be using this index for the fitness level, which is the duration of exercise in seconds times 100. So we're doing 5 minutes, so you can figure that out. And then you're going to multiply 2 times the sum of 3 pulse counts in recovery. Now, you got 4 pulse counts in recovery. I mean, choose the same 3 for both, so it's all relative. So here's the index level. So basically, if you have a higher number, it's a better index. It means you're in better physical condition because you're dividing by the pulse counts, right? So if you're in better shape, that duration of exercise wasn't too much work for you. So your heart rate doesn't get as high. So in recovery, your pulse count should be lower. When you divide by a smaller number, you get a larger number, a larger index. So it's not always like precise, but it's a good way for us to do it in this lab. The other one is the cold pressure test. What I'll do is I'll get some bowls of ice. All you have to do is fill it with water to make the ice slushy, so it's easier to submerge the hand in. And this is going to jump the BP because it's a painful stimulus, as I've warned you about. And we look to see the baroreceptor level it off. And so I have small round bowls there, nothing that big. Well, basically, you're going to see a jump in BP. And here's the data you'll take. Pulse and BP before they submerge your hand, and then after a minute, 2, and 3. So they leave their hand in the whole 3 minutes. Whatever hand is in the bowl, put the cuff on the other arm, right? Because it's a systemic response. You don't have to have it on the same arm. Let's see. Okay, well, you're asked to see if your subject is a hypo or hyperreactor. If you see a rise in blood pressure from 0 to 22, it's hypo. If it jumps more than 23, it's hyper. I usually don't see that. Okay. And also remember, this is very painful. And if the subject doesn't want to do it after like 10 seconds, I can't do this, then see if someone else wants to do it. And if it turns out no one in your group can sustain the pain, well then I guess you have to report that. Okay? I don't ever deduct points for this. I can't force you to subject yourself to something like this. But it's nice if you can do it, right? Get some good data for science. All right, measuring BP in the lab. And so, again, can I have a quick show of hands if you've done this before? Just one. Who's measured BP with a BP cuff? Yeah. Maybe just a few people then. Okay. Well, to make sure we're all on the same page, the principle of blood pressure readings is you're blocking off the brachial artery. So you would inflate the cuff to about 160 because it's never going to be that high, basically. Average is, like I said, what? 120 over 80, right? And so if you're at 160, you're going to occlude the artery. Then you let the cuff pressure sizzle out very slowly, not too fast, not too slow. But when the cuff pressure equals the top number, the systolic, that's the first time you'll let blood through the artery, and it'll be like a valve matching the pulsatile flow. So you should start to hear sounds. The first sound you hear, write that number down, that's the systolic. And then the sounds will get louder, okay? And then you'll hear a huge drop-off in sound or no sound. This should sound like this tapping. It's usually what people hear. This tapping noise. It gets louder and then softer. These sounds that you hear of the blood pulsating through are called the carotid cough sounds at the crook of the elbow. Because, well, you hear the tapping sound, then a huge drop-off in sound. You're basically restoring the laminar flow. When you hear a huge drop-off in sound or no sound, write that number down. That's the diastolic. You've basically restored the laminar flow of blood in the brachial artery. So that's the top number, bottom number. And again, let's watch one more clip to make sure you all know how to take BP measurements good in the lab. Let me find it real quick. Get it up.
Welcome to the Hypertension Awareness and Prevention Program at Yale. Today we'll be showing you a training video. My name is Tiffany.
And my name is David, and today we'll be showing you how to take blood pressure screenings. First, we're going to introduce you to the sphygmomanometer, or blood pressure cuff, and the stethoscope that you'll be using to take blood pressure screenings. So this is the blood pressure cuff, or sphygmomanometer. The cuff is here, including the inflation bladder inside. This is the pressure gauge with the reading on it. And this is the inflation ball, which you use to inflate the cuff, and the valve, which you twist to control the airflow to and from the inflation bladder inside the cuff. This is a stethoscope with a similar design to the ones that you will be using in your screenings. The stethoscope has two earpieces, which should be twisted at a 15-degree angle. The earpieces of the stethoscope should be pointed away from your face, so that when they insert in your ear canals, you can achieve a tight and snug fit. The end of the stethoscope has two sides. One side is a bell and the other side is a diaphragm. The stethoscope can switch between the two sides by grasping the stem and twisting like this and like this. For our purposes, you want to be using the diaphragm. So make sure that when you look at the hole in the middle of the bell is covered. The stethoscope can only use one side at a time, and so when the bell side is covered, this means that the diaphragm is active. If you twist the diaphragm and the bell side is open, the bell side is active and the diaphragm is inactive. So for our purposes, make sure that the diaphragm is active and the bell side is closed.
For the most accurate readings, you should take the blood pressure of someone who has not
So don't worry about that
drink
for us.
alcohol or drink coffee or has done strenuous exercise before the meeting.
And also make sure that you screen the person's blood pressure before they've eaten their meal. First, you want to orient your patient and prepare them for the blood pressure screening. Instruct your patient to outstretch their arm with their palm up on a flat surface like a table, and have them expose their upper arm. If it's not possible for the upper arm to be exposed without constricting the upper arm or leaving it exposed for the blood pressure cuff, then ask the patient to remove their outer layer of clothing so that the cuff can rest directly on the skin of the upper arm. First, make sure that the cuff is fully deflated before beginning your blood pressure screening. To do this, place the cuff flat on a surface and ensure that all the air has been evacuated from the bladder. Either the left arm or the right arm can be used. Have the patient extend their arm on a flat surface and rest it with the palm up at approximately heart level. Take the cuff and align the bottom edge of the cuff approximately 1 inch above the crease of the elbow. Ensure that the artery markings are facing up and wrap the cuff snugly around the arm, tightly enough that the cuff doesn't slide up or down. You want to align the artery markings, depending whether you're using the left arm or the right arm, with a space inside the crease of the elbow, a little bit towards the interior aspect of the upper arm. Since we're using the left arm in this case, we want to align the left arrow just inside the interior aspect, just above the crease of the elbow. Orient the patient and let them know that they will feel tightness and discomfort in their arm temporarily as the cuff inflates. Ensure that the patient doesn't move the arm or talk as you're taking the reading. The inflation gauge has a clip, and there's a corresponding tab on the cuff where you can attach the gauge for easier reading and viewing. Now, you want to take your stethoscope, and again, ensure that the earpieces are angled away from you. As such, take the earpieces and place them in your ear canal to create a tight fit between your ear and the earpieces. First, position the diaphragm of the stethoscope against the skin just above the inner crease of the elbow, so that the surface of the diaphragm rests snugly against the surface of the skin, just below the lower edge of the blood pressure cuff. It's best to hold the diaphragm of your stethoscope with the middle and index fingers so that you don't confuse the radial pulse of your thumb with the pulse of the patient. Grasp the inflation pump in your right or dominant hand and use your thumb and index finger of your right or dominant hand to manipulate the air valve. First, you want to twist the valve all the way to the right or clockwise until you feel it stop. You don't want to over-tighten the valve because you want to be able to carefully control the amount of air escaping from the valve as you decrease the pressure in the cuff. So again, twist the valve all the way clockwise just until you feel it stop, and then stop. Begin by inflating the cuff to about 160 millimeters of mercury by squeezing the cuff, by squeezing the pump to 160. As soon as you reach 160, grasp the valve with your thumb and index finger and slightly twist it counterclockwise to begin allowing air to escape at a controlled rate. As soon as you reach approximately 160, you want to begin to allow air to escape from the blood pressure cuff at a tightly controlled rate. If you allow air to escape too quickly, you will miss the blood pressure reading. But if you allow it to escape too slowly, then you will cause undue discomfort to your patient. The reading at which you first hear the patient's pulse is the systolic blood pressure, and the reading at which you no longer hear their pulse is the diastolic blood pressure. As soon as you no longer hear the patient's pulse, fully deflate the cuff by turning the knob on the valve all the way counterclockwise.
If you get a reading of 120 over 80, a systolic reading of 120 and a diastolic of 80, then that is considered a normal reading for a healthy adult. If you get a reading between 120 to 140 systolic and 80 to 90 diastolic, then it is considered that you are in pre-hypertension. Anything...
Okay, that's good. Basic readings are So the reason why you put the diaphragm of the stethoscope on the medial aspect there, if you dissect away to the artery you're going for, it's the brachial artery in the crook of the elbow. It's called the ACF. It's where they draw blood, but not from the brachial artery. You put it right there, a little bit in the medial aspect. You're trying to put it over, you're trying to listen to that artery. Okay? So when you inflate the cuff, you're shutting it off. And so when you inflate, before you inflate the cuff, if you want to try this technique, you can. You should be able to feel the radial pulse, but when you inflate the cuff, the pulse goes away because you're blocking the artery. And then as you let the air out, I mean, you should be able to feel the pulse again. But really, you're just focused to listen for the noises. Don't listen for anything else except those noises there. If you look at your handout, the lab handout, it says trial 1 and trial 2. Students always ask me about this. The reason for two trials, do it on the same person, you want to see that your numbers are consistent. Okay, so I think it's good to do both trials on the same subject. You don't have to use the same subject for everything, but I'll let you guys handle what that is. We're going to start this right when we get back from our normal break, about 15 minutes. When we come back from the break, we'll right into lab.